Unrest, Art in the Aftermath of the 1992 Los Angeles Riots. It's a book that was years in the making, and not in just the traditional sense in the years of research that it took, but also because this book is also tied to my lived experience of the 1992 Los Angeles riots. So I was a kid when the 92 LA riots broke out, and I lived in what many consider to be the epicenter of the unrest, which was in South LA. I lived about 2 miles from Florence and Normandy Avenues. And so this is the intersection where, for instance, Reginald Denny, the white truck driver, was taken out of his car and beaten on live television. Um, so, I have these vivid memories of the 92 LA riots. I remember being trapped at home, not being able to leave because of the looting, the beatings, and the fires that were happening right outside. And so I remember laying on my grandmother's living room, laying on the floor because me and my brothers, well, my family, they were scared that we would get hit by a stray bullet coming through the window. And so we laid on the floor and watched TV as the neighborhood was burning. I also remember my grandmother running outside of the home and running after her. And we watched the corner convenience store in our neighborhood get looted by neighbors and simultaneously defended with guns by neighbors. And so that sort of like seeming contradictory experience really shaped me. And I think it sort of primed me to look at the complexities of unrest, that they are not black and white experiences, but often are these paradoxes or gray zones. And being a Latino and a multi-generational Latino who grew up in the neighborhood. So just to give you some background, I grew up in South LA. So did both of my parents and my grandparents. And so there's a line in my family, like with one of my grandfathers, where we grew up for generations in this 2-mile radius between Watts and unincorporated South Los Angeles. That's where my great grandparents live, my grandparents, my parents, and where I grew up as a kid. And so with that said, my family, there's also multiple generations in my family who experienced Los Angeles riots. And there were multiple like throughout history. So in the book, I focus on the 92 Los Angeles riots, but I open the book with the recollection of my father and his experience of the 1965 Watts Rebellion. What's interesting about my dad's experience, he was with friends at Yosemite. They were there celebrating their birthdays. And that's when the 1965 Watts Rebellion broke out. And he called my grandma, and my grandma urged him to stay as long as possible away from the city because it was burning down. And so they stayed as long as they could, but they had to go back home. And so I grew up with these stories of my dad has like this picture of him and his friends at Yosemite, but he never talked about Yosemite itself. He talked about what was happening outside of the frame of that photograph. And it like conjured, memories of him and his friends having to navigate all the police barricades to get back home in unincorporated South LA at that time, and having to navigate the National Guardsmen that were on the streets. And they were, Mexican American and Japanese American boys, having to navigate, this sort of apocalyptic version of the neighborhood they grew up in. And so that too, like encountering stories like that from my family, and even thinking about that photograph of my dad at Yosemite, which was never, ever about, that national treasure of the United States. That Yosemite photo was always about Watts and the Watts Rebellion in 65. I think my lived experience, that of my family's lived experience, like that story from my dad, it really trained me to look at the stories that are not covered by mainstream histories or in mainstream press, um, because I knew there were these lived experiences that were equally important but underreported, but that still existed and were being carried through families. And as an art historian, I recognized that they were also being carried through artworks. And so as I began studying the 92 Los Angeles riots and its art history, I quickly recognized there were not just artists who were adults at the time in 92 who were making artworks, but there were now newer generations of artists making works. And so currently there's about three generations, different generations of artists who've made works about the 92 Los Angeles riots. And in this book, I focus on two generations. So artists who were adults at the time and made work in response to the unrest or to the videotape police beating of Rodney King or other related episodes of racial violence and state violence. But also I look at artists who were children like me at the time and who went on to become professional artists and who went back to this history and were reflecting on it. And they were not only reflecting on it as this event that neatly happened in the past and that was over, but they recognized how this event was still continuing across time and was related to current episodes of racial and state violence. So Juan Capistran is a multimedia artist who also grew up in South Central Los Angeles. And he was a teenager during the time of the unrest in 92. And he grew up to have art career as a professional artist. But even since he was a student, he started making works about this history. And so he has multiple series of artworks about the unrest in 92. And one of these works is a date painting. It's called April 29th, 1992, Fidel. It was made in 2012 in one of the major anniversaries of the 1992 Los Angeles riots. So when you see this painting, it's just a date across the canvas. And it's under this thin wash of what seems to be paint. But this isn't actually paint. Instead, it's a medium made with blood, sweat, tears, orange juice, and what the artist describes as ashes. And so April 29th, 1992, it was the first day of the unrest. So earlier that day, a jury acquitted the four LAPD officers who were filmed beating Rodney King. They acquitted them of charges. And this spurred protests and demonstrations, first at the courthouse in Simi Valley, and then spread throughout Los Angeles, with many episodes of protests, looting, and then beatings and fires happening in South Central, where the artist grew up. And these blood, sweat, and tears that are part of it, they speak to one, the physical demands on the body and experiencing this type of serious episode. And they also speak to the life and death stakes that were at play. Not only that of Rodney King, who experienced a harrowing beating by the police, but also other episodes of racial violence that occurred as well. So one of these episodes, which Capistran discusses, is that of the killing of Latasha Harlins, who was a 15-year-old African-American girl who was shot in the back of the head by a Korean shop owner. She was accused of stealing a bottle of orange juice the year before, in March 1991, the same month that the videotape of King was recorded. her killing was captured on surveillance video in the convenience store. And what's really moving is that Juan Capistan, he was a schoolmate of Latasha Harlan's. They went to school together in South Central, where that convenience store is located. And Juan, he grew up walking distance from that convenience store. And so that's where in the medium he includes orange juice as a reference to Harlan's and her murder and the significance of that incident to the history of the 1992 Los Angeles riots. And the blood, sweat, and tears, we can also think of that as, a metaphor for the physical obliteration of the body caused by death or caused by beatings. And then the ashes. What Juan Capistrán did is he went to empty lots that still exist in the neighborhood, where buildings were burnt down and never rebuilt. And he collected the dirt from these lots and he incorporated that into the medium as well. What you'll notice in the title of this work, it's subtitled Fidel. So Fidel is a reference to Fidel Lopez, who was a Guatemalan immigrant who, like Reginald Denny, the white truck driver, who was taken out of his car and beaten in South Central on Florence and Normandy Avenues. Fidel Lopez was a Guatemalan immigrant who was also pulled out of his vehicle and beaten. And this was also captured on videotape. Yet what we remember as a nation is not Fidel Lopez or the numerous other people of color who were beaten in the intersection of Florence and Normandy. We as a nation remember only the white truck driver, Reginald Denny, who experienced this. And so the artwork at once, it's remembering Fidel Lopez, it's remembering Latasha Harlan's, the importance of their lives and experiences to the 92 Los Angeles riots. And it's a critique, I think, of us as a society in devaluing the lives of like a Black girl or the Central American man, and inscribing within that date the many stories we might not know yet. And so that's one thing I hope from this book, is that it spurs more scholarship, because there are so many artworks. Like I mentioned, there are like 3 generations now of artists who've continued to go back to this history and make work. And that means that there's many more stories that need to be told, that need to be remembered. Because when we do that, when we retell the stories, when we remember them, when we read about them, when they're written about, that brings value. That brings respect to these lives that were lived and lost. Another very important work that I write about in Unrest is by an artist and filmmaker named La Tipa, also known as Michelle Dizon. So in 2008, she made a short film called Civil Society. And so this is a multi-channel film, which means that there's multiple frames that you're watching as a viewer at once. And her film includes archival images of not just the 1992 Los Angeles riots or the police beating of Rodney King, but the 1965 Watts Rebellion, as well as contemporary film footage of France. And there was an episode of Unrest in France in the 2000s. And when that French episode broke out, which occurred around the same time as Hurricane Katrina, it really had her thinking back to her lived experiences of civil unrest, and that being the 1992 Los Angeles riots. So she was a teenager in 1992, 15 years old. And so what her film does is it blurs the boundaries, the neat boundaries of time and space. So while you're watching footage of the rebellion in 65, she's talking about her memories of the 92 Los Angeles riots, for instance. And this was also an incredibly important film that inspired my thinking about unrest. In the film, she also ends up talking about grief and the grief that surrounds the 92 LA riots and her experiences of it. And so that sort of underscored for me how unrest is an act of bereavement. And again, of this driver for artists to return to it again and again. But also it helped me think about the larger global ramifications of unrest and the legacies of white supremacy in other parts of the world, or the legacies of things like colonialism and how they unfold today. And there's this part in the film at the end, and I write about this in the book. It always made me cry. And my response to those tears was always to fight it. I was growing up, like taught you shouldn't cry. It was like a sign of weakness. And so I always like tried to bottle it back up. But I decided to sit in that space of that like hold and to try to figure out why was I having these responses to the film? And it's because of the emotional registers of the film and that space for grieving that Latipa creates in the film for herself and by extension for the viewer. And it really made me think about my own memories of the 92 Los Angeles riots, the videotape beating of Rodney King, as well as the racial violence and death that I witnessed as a kid. And there's this part during that end where Latipa concludes that the ruins of the 1992 Los Angeles riots, they have nothing to do really with the destruction that happened or the fires or the ash or the smoke in the sky, but that the ruins were herself. And that's really like what was getting to me, was thinking about how we are ruins, but also in a way, it made me think more powerfully about what it means to be a ruin. And also the fact that civil society, it's always in ruins, that it is imperfect, and that people of color and the marginalized are a reminder of that. And so in the book, I discuss how we are ruins of civil society and that we must demand and make sure that this faulty vision of what society should be, meaning the injustices, the state violence, that it is up to us to ensure that they end. And so in that way, artists like Latipa, they use imagination to think through of real ways towards liberation. And that's like a very important and powerful, not only just an idea, but a thing that we must all strive towards.